Before we get started, I want to go over the homework for last week. Remember that was Psalm 142. The questions are, is there a chiasm in verse 1? And what about verse 2? And the criteria, the things that I want you to do to accomplish this, to answer these questions, are first, compare at least 2 English translations, and then compare them with the Hebrew word order. Let me bring up my Bible app, eSword, and we'll take a look at this. This can be really tricky, and I'll show you why. So, first thing we have, I've copied over the English Standard Version and the King James Version into my word processor. It's one of the first steps I do when I'm looking for chiasms or any kind of literary structures like parallelisms. I copy the text into a word processor so that I can move text around. You can do this on paper if you want. You can print it out and then mark it up with pen or pencil or highlighters, whatever you want to do. I find it's much easier to use a word processor because that lets me rearrange things on the fly. I can highlight something and then I can remove the highlight or change the color. It's a whole lot easier than having to print it out multiple times and changing things around. So first, let's compare the English Standard Version with the King James. These are both literal translations. King James tends to be a little bit more literal than the English Standard, but the ESV is one of the more literal English translations, and it's pretty good. So it starts out, also notice that up here at the top, I separated out the superscription because it's not really part of the psalm. It's just kind of an introduction telling you who wrote it and why. When you look at the Hebrew and when you look at Jewish translations, the superscription will frequently get its own verse, so that then the psalm actually starts in verse 2. And that's going to be really important when we look at the Hebrew translation later and compare it to the English. So the ESV says, a prayer with my voice I cry out to the Lord, with my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. Now, if you didn't already know, whenever you see Lord in all capital letters in an English translation, it actually means that the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, is in the Hebrew. So this would more technically read, with my voice I cry out to Yahweh. With my voice I plead for mercy to Yahweh. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. Now this kind of sounds more like a parallelism. It says, with my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. So those are kind of parallel, saying the same things. Actually, this right here should be part of the superscription. Let me move that up here. There you go. You could also maybe think that that's anaphora with the first phrase repeated, but usually with anaphora you should have at least 3 or more lines all repeating that first phrase or the first words. Now down in the King James, the word order is very different. I cried unto Yahweh with my voice unto Yahweh did I make my supplication. Now that's very different, and that sounds like it could be a chiasm. I cried would be paired with I made my supplication unto Yahweh, and with my voice paired with my voice. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. And again, this is kind of sounds like it might be a chiasm because it has this before him kind of sort of in the middle in verse 2. So we want to switch over in eSword, switch over to the King James Version Plus. The KJV Plus means that it has the King James Version words, and then next to each word, it has the Hebrew or Greek, depending on which part of the Bible you're in, Strong's index numbers. Now, Strong's isn't necessarily a great dictionary to use, but it is a really great tool for seeing the Hebrew words that are behind the English letters, or behind the English words in the translations, and also using the King James Concordance for finding where those words appear in Scripture elsewhere. But we're going to use it to verify the Hebrew word order. Since the Psalms in all of the Old Testament, except for a few small parts, were actually written in Hebrew, you can't always see that something is a chiasm or a parallelism by looking only at the English. If you've ever done any kind of translation or learned a foreign language, you'll realize that a lot of things can't be translated directly from one language to another. Sometimes you have to move words around or restructure a sentence because word order is different. Grammar makes, say, the direct object come before the verb, or the subject might come later. You just have to be aware of those things. And you don't necessarily have to know Hebrew to be able to verify the word order in the original. You can use a tool like eSword with the King James, or with the Strong's numbers. So in this table down here, I'm going to put the words from the King James along with their Strong's index number. And let's see, I've got I cried, which is 2199, unto 413, Yudevavhe 3068, with my voice 6963, with my voice 6963, unto 413, Yudevavhe 3068. Did I make my supplication? All right, now that's verse 1. I cried unto Yahweh with my voice unto Yahweh, I make supplication. It really looks like a chiasm there, doesn't it? But let's be sure that the Hebrew word order is the same. We'll switch over to the Hebrew Old Testament. The OT plus means that it has Strong's numbers next to it. Now, it's helpful if you can read these Hebrew letters and sound out the words at least, but you don't have to be able to. You can just look at these numbers to verify the word order. You're not trying to make your own translation. You're just trying to make sure that the Hebrew word order matches the English. So in the Hebrew for verse 1, and remember that this is actually verse 2, because in Hebrew, the superscription gets its own verse number. So the psalm actually starts in verse 2. So it starts out with, another thing to note is that Hebrew reads from right to left instead of left to right. So see how the verse numbers are over here on the right side? So this is the first word in the verse. And already there's a difference from the King James English. The first word is 6963, which is actually with my voice. So 6963, 413, 3068. 2199, 6963, 413, 3068, 2503, or 2603, sorry. All right, so some things are the same, but there are some significant differences, especially in the first half of this verse. So what we're going to do is rearrange the English words to match the Hebrew word order. So this is actually the first word in the verse. And then 2199 goes down here. So that matches the Hebrew word order now. All right, so this entire verse in King James is now in the right word order to match the Hebrew. So we'll read it, and it sounds kind of awkward because whenever you translate one language into another, if you translate it exactly word for word, it's always going to sound a little awkward. With my voice unto Yahweh I cried. With my voice unto Yahweh I make supplication. So that actually still kind of makes sense. It's a little awkward, but no more awkward than the rest of the King James. But now it doesn't really sound like a chiasm anymore. With my voice unto Yahweh I cried. With my voice unto Yahweh I make supplication. This is actually very similar to the English Standard Word Order. With my voice, I cry out to Yahweh. With my voice, I plead for mercy to Yahweh. So even in the ESV, it doesn't follow the exact word order. It would be more like, with my voice to Yahweh, I cry out. And with my voice to Yahweh, I plead for mercy. That's how you would rearrange it in the English Standard. So it is sort of a parallelism because you've got, with my voice to Yahweh, I cry out. With my voice to Yahweh, I plead for mercy. So you can see how this phrase connects with this phrase. They mean essentially the same thing, and so on like that. Now, So that is not a chiasm. That one's a parallelism. So let's look at verse 2. Take all these out from verse 1 and we'll put verse 2 in there instead. So again, from the King James, if you have an English Standard with the Strong's numbers on it, I don't have one, and the ESV here, there is an ESV plus, but it's not really the same. There may be an English Standard or some other version out there that has the strong numbers, but the King James is here in eSword and it's free. So that's the one I use. All right, so again, verse 2. I poured out is 82:10. My complaint, 7879. Before 6440. I shewed 5046. Before 6440. Him my trouble, 68869. It's really before him. All right, so now let's switch over to the Hebrew and see if the word order matches. And remember, in the Hebrew, this is going to be verse 3 instead of verse 2. Okay, verse 3, we've got 82:10, 6440, so there's already a difference. 7879, 6869, 6440, and 5046. All right, so there's a significant difference here also. So let's rearrange the English to match the Hebrew. My complaint, take that, him is supposed to be here before him. Okay, does that match? All right, now those numbers are in order. So this is the Hebrew word order, but with English words. So if we read that just word for word, I pour out before him my complaint. My trouble before him I showed. So do we have a chiasm here? On the outside, we have something that I am doing, and then we have to whom we are doing it, or for whom. And then in the middle, we have the thing that we are doing, or the thing that we are presenting. So that does look like a chiasm. Now, let's rearrange the English Standard to match the Hebrew. I pour out before him my complaint, my trouble before him I tell. So I pour out before him my complaint, my trouble before him I tell. And there we have a chiasm with our trouble and our complaint in the middle and what we're doing with it at the bookends. Does that make sense? And that's how you handle a very short chiasm, or that's how you diagram it out, verify that it's actually a chiasm. The shorter it is, the more important the Hebrew word order is going to be. All right, I hope that helps understand some of the stuff that we were doing last week. And then let's move on to the Chiasm Course, Part 4. All right, so far in the Chiasm Course, I've introduced you to chiasms and to literary structures of various kinds that are in the Bible. We looked at some parallelisms and 3 chiasms. Then we talked about how to find a chiasm, how to prepare for your study, how to search the scriptures to find that literary structure, how to validate it to make sure that it is one, and we've just given a demonstration of that, how to map it all out, and how to interpret it. Today, we're going to look at some more chiasms. These are going to be a little more involved, a little more detailed. You'll get a better idea of how to find and map out much longer chiasms that don't depend so much on the Hebrew word order. And surprisingly, we're going to look at a chiasm in a Disney movie. I'm not a huge fan of Disney, but they have done some good storytelling in the past, and much of it is even edifying. And we'll get a sample of one of those good stories here in a bit. So let's start with finding chiasms. Just a recap of some of the stuff we've already gone over. Maybe there will be something new in here. The first thing you need to do is read the whole passage so that you can get context. Now in this course, I'm not really reading the whole passage for you because we just don't have time for that. So I'm kind of taking a shortcut and zeroing in on the specific parts of the passages where I want to look at chiasms. But when you're doing your own study, just to make sure you understand the full context of what you're reading, who is doing the writing, who they're writing to, why are they writing it, what is the overall subject, you need to understand that before you can really understand the purpose of a chiasm. While you're reading, take lots of notes. You can take notes on the meaning of what you're reading, what it means to you. But when you're looking for a chiasm, the specific kind of notes you want to take are lists of repetitions, of main ideas, people, places, numbers, just the important words that pop out at you. Specifically, you want to watch for repetition. That's one of the most important things, whether it's a repetition of specific words or of ideas or people or circumstances, which is one you might not think of, but the circumstances of a story in Scripture will often repeat themselves, sometimes in reverse order, sometimes in the same order, sometimes all scrambled. And how it's repeated could be important to what it really means. Next, copy the text into a word processor. Now, this is my preferred method, and I think it's a lot more efficient. You can print it out, or you can write it out if you want, however it works for you. Highlight parallel pairs, the elements of a literary structure. The basic elements of Hebrew poetry and most Hebrew literary structures are parallels. Once you've paralleled a couple of them, you can work your way inwards or you can work your way out until you find the edges of the structure, and you want to define the outside edges, the bookends, and you want to find the center, also called the axis. All right, so let's look at our first chiasm tonight. This is one from Leviticus 23. It's not a huge chiasm, but it's a structure inside of a structure. So we're going to look at the whole chapter just very briefly, just to get some context, and then we're going to zero in on one particular part. And as we're looking at this, I want you to watch for parallels and interruptions in the text. Specifically, look for actions, things that have to be done, numbers that are repeated, anything about timing and days and instructions. This is just part of it because we really don't have time to read it all. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, On the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days, is the feast of booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. Now, even in this short little excerpt, you can see some repetition. There's the 7th month, the 7th day, first day, 7 days, 8th day, lots of stuff about days, things about offerings that are repeated. So here's an outline of the whole chapter, just to put this in context. It talks about the appointed times of Yahweh, the weekly Sabbath, more about appointed times of Yahweh, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, early first fruits. Now those three holidays, Passover, unleavened bread, and the early first fruits, in common vernacular, even in the New Testament, those are all combined into a single term, either called the week of Passover or the week of unleavened bread, and they're all just kind of rolled up into one. Then it talks about the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, also known as Pentecost, the Day of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Then it goes to more appointed times of Yahweh, or it uses that phrase again, and then it goes back to the weekly Sabbath, and then back to the Feast of Sukkot, and back to the appointed times of Yahweh. So you can see that there's some repetition in here. The appointed times of Yahweh, that's talked about 4 times, with the weekly Sabbath in between 2 of them. So there's some kind of structure going on there. We're not really going to look at that because there's another structure that's just off to the side, right here. Notice how it's talking about all of these different appointed times, all of the feast days of God, and then it gets to Sukkot and then skips back to a summary of the feast days and then back to the weekly Sabbath and then finishes talking about Sukkot. So there's another structure going on within this broader structure in Leviticus 23. Sukkot on the outside, and then something pairing the appointed times with the weekly Sabbath. So here's that passage in Esword, or at least part of it. And here's how I take notes when I'm looking for a chiasm. I love to use bullet points, and once again, I like to use a word processor. And as I read, I will just type out the words that jump out at me. As you're reading, it may be different words or different ideas that jump out at you. The important thing is that you're looking for the patterns. And the piece of the pattern that you see might be different than the piece that I see. But if we're doing an honest reading, letting the text speak for itself, and then interpreting it in light of the rest of Scripture, we'll usually come out with the same pattern at the end, even though we might have a few differences. I might break out a point one way and you might break it out a different way, but it should look very similar. All right, so in verse 33, Yahweh spoke to Moses. Verse 34, speak to the people. 15th day, 7th month, 7 days. Feast of Booths, verse 35. First day is a holy convocation, no work to be done. Verse 36. 7 days, present food offerings. 8th day is a holy convocation, and there's more food offerings and assembly there, kind of a repetition. Verse 37, appointed times, holy convocation, offerings, food offerings, grain offerings, all the different offerings, each on its proper day. And then in verse 38, got the weekly Sabbath, actually not the weekly Sabbath, the Lord's Sabbaths. Gifts and offerings, verse 39, 15th day of the 7th month, 7 days. First and 8th day, no work, solemn assembly. Verse 40, on the first day, fruit, trees, and branches. 7 days you rejoice. Verse 41, celebrate it as a feast forever, 7 days in the 7th month. Verse 42, dwell in booths for 7 days, and then booths. Verse 43, generations will know that what God has done. I am Yahweh. And here's all of those notes on a single page. Some of these I'm sure that you would have broken out differently, especially like in verse 41 or verse 39, where there was some more information that I just kind of lumped in together with one thing. But let's look at some of the patterns we've got here. At the beginning and at the end, we have stuff that God wants people to know. God is saying this because, first he's saying, Moses, tell this to people. So he wants the people to know it. And then at the end he says, you'll do this so that the generations will know that I am Yahweh. So it begins and ends with Yahweh and what he wants the people to know. Now inside of that, you've got all of these different numbers, 15, 7, 7, first day, 8th day, offerings, all of this stuff. And there doesn't really seem to be a clear pattern here. About the only thing that really connects all of these different numbers together is that these are all instructions on when and how to keep the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. It says the 15th day of the 7th month for 7 days, you live in booths. There are offerings. First day is a Sabbath. The 8th day is a Sabbath. And it says this in different orders, rearranges it a little bit, but it does it in 2 chunks. Each of these chunks of text are about how, about how to keep the Feast of Sukkot. All right, now inside of that, we have some text about God's appointed times and God's Sabbaths. And we've got offerings. The first one says, these are my appointed times, my holy convocations, and these are the offerings you're going to do. And after that, it talks about, and these are my Sabbaths, and these are the gifts and offerings you're going to do. Now, these are not in reverse order. So those two are not separate elements in the chiasm. Those are like a small parallelism within the chiasm. But then we've got this one day right in the middle. We'll figure out what to do with that here in a minute. Informing the people is on the outside. How and when to do Sukkot are inside of that. And then you've got all God's appointed times with their offerings and Sabbath with its offerings. I put the yellow and the green there in a single element, the chiasm. And then in the center, you've got the proper day. And what is the point of that being in the axis? All of these times and dates, the 15th day, the 7th month, the 7th day, the 1st day, the 8th day, the morning and evening offerings that happen during these things, everything has to happen at the proper time. It's very important to God that we do these things on the right day. And that is the axis of this chiasm. All of this is about doing it God's way, not our way. Now let me show you exactly why that's so important. Remember Solomon's son, Rehoboam. He taxed the people. Solomon's general Jeroboam rebelled against the taxes and split off the northern kingdom, became a separate kingdom from Judah. And in Scripture, the northern kingdom is called either Israel or Ephraim or Samaria, depending on the context and who's writing. But Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom. And one of the first things he did was create his own separate feast of Sukkot. Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. He offered sacrifices on the altar. And down at the bottom, he instituted a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. He went up to the altar. So here we've got a bonus chiasm, talking about Sukkot again, and talking about when Sukkot is happening. But in this case, Jeroboam did it in Bethel instead of Jerusalem. He sacrificed to the calves that he made instead of to Yahweh. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places instead of the priests of God. Notice up here at the top that it says, Jeroboam appointed a feast like the feast that was in Judah, but it wasn't the feast that was in Judah. He did it in the month that he devised from his own heart and not the month that God said to do it. So it's very important to God that we get his feasts at the right time. Now, there's definitely room for some disagreement. There are some ambiguities in Scripture on when the feast days are supposed to happen. And to be totally honest, it's not even possible for us to keep the feast days exactly the way that God commanded. We're not in the land. There is no temple that we can go to. There's no functioning priesthood at the temple. We can't bring offerings to the altar. So we are, in a way, doing a Sukkot according to our own hearts, because we can't do it the way that God said to do it. But we're not doing it according to our own hearts because that's what we want to do. We're trying to do it the way that God wants it done in our current circumstances, the best we can where we are now. And that's okay, because we're not trying to rebel. We're not making sacrifices. We know that we're not in Jerusalem. We're not trying to substitute our plan for God's. We're trying to keep God's plan the best we can where we are. All right, so let's look at this chiasm in Disney. And this comes from Beauty and the Beast. And this was done before Disney went completely mad. This chiasm isn't my discovery. I don't sit around analyzing cartoons for literary structures. This is actually the work of somebody who calls himself the Deja Reviewer. His hobby is finding chiasms in television and film. And he's got a website. You can see that bit.ly link on the screen. Go ahead and follow that link if you want to know, if you want to see more of what he has done. And specifically, that will take you to his diagram of this chiasm, and he has a lot more detail than I do, but we don't need to show all of the detail. All right, so let's look at this story. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the Beauty and the Beast. You may have read it, a shorter fairy tale version or something when you were young. If you have children of your own or you have grandchildren, then you have almost certainly seen the Disney version of this story. I think I've seen it 1,000 times. So at the beginning and the end of Beauty and the Beast, there's this stained glass window. At the beginning of the movie, it shows the curse of the beast. It shows the monster. At the end, it shows the restoration of the beast, him standing with Bel. At the beginning of the movie, the townsfolk remark about how odd Bel is. But at the end, the castle staff, who were pretty odd themselves, have returned to normal and accepted Bel as one of their own, and they celebrate with her instead of ostracizing her. In the first half, Maurice, who is Bel's father, he despairs because of the failure of his inventions and how badly things are going for him, but Bel encourages him. In the last half of the movie, it's the beast who's despairing, but Bel loves him. In the first half, Maurice enters the castle and is welcomed by the castle staff. In the last half, the townsfolk enter the castle, but they're attacked by the castle staff. So notice how at each of these points, something is being contrasted with the other side. This is what we call an antithetic chiasm. It's also a sympathetic chiasm because it's from beginning to end, it's showing the progression of a story. So it's not telling part of the story in reverse, but the individual elements of the chiasm are presented as contrasts with each other, which makes it an antithetic chiasm. So it's both at the same time. In the first half, Bel is terrified of the beast, but she learns to accept him and she stands up to him later. She's no longer scared. In the first half of the story, Bel escapes from the castle and runs away from the beast. But in the second half, Bel returns to the castle to help him. And in the center, this is the axis of the chiasm, the beast rescues Bel from the wolves. This entire chiasm isn't so much about the story of, the priest turning, or the beast turning into the man at the end and falling in love with Bel. It's about the transformation of his character. That's the main point of this story, is the transformation of the man who is behaving as a beast to the man who is behaving like the prince. There's also the transformation of Maurice and Bel, and they all pivot at this one point where things change for everybody. Now, there are also other character arcs in here too, with Gaston and other characters that change. At one point, there's a point in the chiasm where the beast is fighting the wolves at the top of a cliff. And then on the other side of the chiasm, Gaston is fighting the beast on the castle walls. And the beast survives and he's rescued by Bel, whereas Gaston, who is an oppressor of Bel, he falls off the castle and dies. I'm not sure if Disney actually put any thought into creating this as a chiasm. I suspect that it was really more of, they were trying to include these character arcs within the story. And a good novelist will include multiple subplots within the overarching story. So the main character and sub-characters will all be going through their character transformations throughout the story, and these things will peak at separate times. In our modern Western fiction, we're used to seeing the climax at or close to the very end of the story. But in these character arcs, the climax is often in the middle, where there's some event that changes the nature of the character that enables him to resolve the plot later and reach that story climax. And that's what you're seeing here in this chiasm. All right, so let's move on to our third chiasm. This one is in the book of John. This one is much longer and more complicated. And as you're reading this, I want you to focus on the clear parallels and look for thematic connections between ideas. And keep in mind that John was a mystic, and he was trying to convey some very complex, not sure what the right word there is, some deep ideas with a few words. And so the way that he words things can be confusing. He repeats himself in odd ways or uses unusual turns of phrases in order to get across an idea without actually spelling it out for you. Eventually he gets around to spelling it out too, but he's trying to lead you there through imagery first. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And again, I'm not going to read the whole chapter because we just don't have time for that. But these are going through my notes just to show you this demonstration again, exactly how I take notes when I'm reading through a passage looking for a structure. So verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, beginning, God. Verse 3, made, created. 4, life, light. Verse 5, light, darkness, not overcome. Man from God. Then there's John as a witness, witness about the light so that you'd believe. He's not the light, but he's witnessing about the light. In verse 9, then there's the true light who's come into the world. Everything that was made was created through him. The world didn't recognize him. He came to his own and they didn't receive him. Verse 12, all who received, believed, became children of God. Verse 13, wasn't born of flesh or will, but born of God. Verse 14, Word became flesh, dwelt among us, glory, Son from God, grace and truth. Verse 15, John is a witness. John was after, Yeshua was before. Verse 16, fullness was received, grace upon grace. 17, the law came by Moses, and grace and truth came by Jesus. In verse 18, we've seen God, who's the only God. He's at the Father's side. The Father's made him known. All right, so these are the words that I wrote down as I was reading through this passage, looking for patterns. And you can see that there's a lot of repetition here. But like before, the repetition itself doesn't clearly create a pattern, at least not one that I can see right away. But keeping in mind that John was a mystic and probably not using specific words, but ideas. These are the ideas that John was talking about. He talked about time sequence, relation to God, creation, light and darkness, witnessing the truth, believing and rejecting, and transformation. So let's see where these come out in my notes here. Time sequence in the beginning, and sequence of John and Yeshua, who was before and after. Relationship to God, mostly how Jesus relates to God. All right, and then creation, everything that was made was created through him. And then light and darkness, understanding that light and darkness aren't literally light, but ideological light. It means understanding or not understanding, or truth and lies. So I'm including grace and truth with this concept of light and darkness. Witnessing, John came as a witness. And then believing and rejecting. Mostly this is talking about how people didn't recognize him, but those who do recognize him are able to become sons of God. And that's where the transformation comes in. Yeshua was transformed when he came into the world. When he came to his own, man transforms into children of God. And then there's more about the transformation of Yeshua and the transformation of mankind through both the law and grace and truth. But once again, there's really no clear pattern here in the text. But there's so much repetition, there must be some kind of pattern, it seems. There must be some kind of structure here. So remember that the Apostle John was a mystic. He wasn't a lawyer. Now, when you're looking at books of the law, literary structures will usually be fairly clean-cut. They might be complex and they're very deliberate. But John might not have been writing a deliberate chiasm. He was just writing about ideas. And this passage is really about the identities of the missions of Yeshua and John. So instead of looking at specific words, which would be important in a small antimetabole or a small chiasm or in a legal literary structure, we'll look at ideas, the big ideas, so we look bigger. Specifically, we're going to look at the identity of Yeshua, the mission of Yeshua, the identity of John, and the mission of John, because that's really what this passage is all about, is those four ideas. So first, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. This is all about the identity of Yeshua, who he is. He is the Word. He was in the beginning with God. So this is establishing his divinity and his authority and his function, and then his mission. In him was life, and life was the light of men. This is why he came. He came to bring life and light to men. And then there's the identity of John. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. And why did he come? He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light. And more about John, he was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. So that seems like it might be a parallelism there. And then this long passage, the true light. He came to his own. This is all about Yeshua's mission. He's the true light who came to give light to everybody. He came so that those who received him, who believed in his name, could become the children of God. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. And then finally, back to the identity of Yeshua. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Yeshua has made God known, and in turn, the Father has made the Son known. So here we start to see more of a structure. On the outside, we have the identity of Yeshua. Inside of that, we have Yeshua's mission. And then inside that, there's sort of a parallelism there with the identity and mission of John. And then we've got this center part, that all might believe through him. And that is really what this passage is about. It's about seeing Yeshua. Yeshua brings the light. John the Baptist, not John the author of this gospel. John witnesses about that light so that we will see it, so that we will believe. So here's a diagram. A and A prime, Yeshua was with God as Word, Creator, and God. And at the bottom, Yeshua at the Father's side reveals the Father, and the Father reveals the Son. Inside that is Yeshua's mission. He came to bring life and light to the darkness. He came to remake people into children of God. And then there's this parallelism about the identity and mission of John. John was sent from God. He bore witness about the light. John was not the light. He bore witness about the light. And then in the center, so that all might believe. What's more appropriate for an ancient mystic than to ask, who are we? Why are we here? Now, this was John the Baptist's entire mission, was to prepare the ground, to prepare the way for the Messiah. And this is also John the Divine, the author of the Gospel of John. This is his mission, to point at Yeshua, to show us all who he was, his identity and his mission, so that we will believe in him. So we've looked at three chiasms here. First, Leviticus 23, 33 to 43. It's about Sukkot and all of God's appointed times, and just how important it is to God that we meet him at the time that he has set aside. Can you imagine if you had a date, and your date says, meet me at the restaurant Friday at 7 p.m., and you show up Thursday at 4? You're not going to build much of a relationship from there. So meeting God at his appointed times is important to him. Then we looked at Disney's Beauty and the Beast and how the Beast finds love and Belle finds a community. And they are both transformed through that story. And not just them, but both of their communities, the townspeople and the staff at the castle. And then in John 1, 1 through 18, the identities and missions of Jesus and John the Baptist. What the entire New Testament is all about, so that we will see, know, and believe in Yeshua the Messiah. So far in the Chiasm course, we've had an introduction to chiasms. We looked at some literary structures, talked about how to find chiasms. Then we looked at some more literary structures, recapping how to find chiasms. We looked at Leviticus 23, Disney's Beauty and the Beast, and John 1. Next week, we're going to look at chiasm-enhanced living, the dangers and values of chiasms. We're going to talk about some list of criteria that you can put a potential chiasm through to make sure that it's not a fake one, that you're not just seeing a pattern that isn't really there. Now, there is no hard and fast rule, but there are some criteria that you can look at and say, if this chiasm meets, say, all 10 of these criteria, it's almost definitely a chiasm. If it meets 7 of the 10, it probably is, but if it only meets 3 of them, there's a problem. This is actually going to be the reverse, where if it meets all of these criteria, it is not a chiasm. but we'll look at that later. And then we're going to talk about how this can improve your Bible study, how it can help you understand the scriptures, and in turn, live a better life.